Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Gloucestershire Pension Board. First item, declaration. Oh, apologies first. Have we had any apologies?
No, I have no apologies received.
Okay, thank you. And then declarations of interest. Are there any new declarations of interest that anybody wants to make?
I think, Chairman, in view of an email I've only just received from Matthew, I just declare that I'm a board member of the Lower Severn Internal Drainage Board.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Is that in respect of the evaluation?
Well, purely as my membership. Yeah. I don't know if Matthew would care to elaborate, because I liaised with him over the week last night.
Yeah, I've issued, Colin, the conflicts of interest policy and a declaration for the conflicts of interest policy, and as per others within your role, obviously, I'm expecting Colin will, as he has done there, declared that he is a board member of there. It's a known conflict. As a role as an employer representative, you will have that conflict, but it will be noted on the declarations of interest register moving forward.
But there's no reason to exclude Colin from any of the items.
Thank you.
No.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next item then is the minutes from our previous meeting of the 21st of July. Are there any issues of accuracy with those minutes? First, people want me to page them, or are people happy to take them as a whole? We'll take them as a whole. Are there any matters of accuracy people want to raise?
Nope.
Okay, and then are there any matters arising that people wish to pick up?
I think so. Actually, Chairman, which Matthew has said looking into, which is the question of total return analyses between income and capital returns.
Matthew?
Yeah, there's something still ongoing within the performance reporting that we're working through with Brunel. So there will be an upcoming new performance reporting. So that will be something that once we've got that and we've issued that around, we'll see what additional information may or may not be required as we move through on that. So performance reporting will be something that will be changing over the forthcoming quarters, over the next two forthcoming quarters.
Thank you.
Are there any other matters arising from the minutes?
I think there was one action on the risk register, Sean, just to pick up about reformatting. The risk register is a product that is supplied by Aon Consultancy. We've been working with them on that. There was one of the label changes and the headings that will come through in the next iterations because it's a kind of a centralized risk register that we're utilizing in a product that we take. So their developers will be making those changes moving forward. The changes that are reflecting, because there was one of the risks missing, it is contained in the current risk register that's in the papers.
Okay, thank you. Any other items? Okay, thank you. Moving on then to the pension fund committee minutes from their meeting 23rd of September. Are there any matters that members wish to raise from those minutes? I think most of the items will be on our agenda, so we'll take most of the items later in our meeting. Is there anything there that's not on our agenda that people want to raise or question?
No, everything should be covered in the papers.
Okay, thank you. In that case, I think, Matthew, it takes us on to item 5, which is the quarterly update.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. And good morning, everyone on this. Apologies for the size of the packs that have come through to you again. There was a lot of activity that is going through committee in September for the board to review an overarch. Like I said previously, what we try and do is contain the key parts of the information within the covering report. So obviously, if members are able to just read the covering reports, that should bring out the salient points. And then the appendices are there if you want to dive that little bit deeper into any of that information as we move forward. So the first item, which is the usual standing agenda item, The majority of that with the part one, where committee received an update for the quarter ending June. So this is now a little while back, but obviously a backward look and a retrospective look at the position of the fund and the activities around the fund. What I also done in your report here is bring in one or two other single item agenda items that committee received as information for yourselves. So just to kind of take through very high level, in regard of the funding position. The funding position at the end of June was still positive compared to where we were in 2019. Now, a bit later on in agenda item 12, Victoria from Hymans is going to be joining us, and she's going to be talking you through, and I just emailed out some slides to yourselves that she'll walk through with ourselves around the outcome of that valuation process and where we are within that valuation. So if you're keen-eyed, you'll see there's a slight conflict in the information that you've got in that later paper versus the paper that you've got at this moment on the funding level. That funding level that we're publishing here is actually still based on the 2019 valuation assumptions and rolled forward on that basis. That's why there is that difference between those two numbers. This will be rebased, and that funding position will be rebased once the 22 valuation has actually then been agreed and taken forward and the assumptive basis changed. So we're always within a valuation cycle in this period where the published number that we're using based on the old valuation basis compared to where we are with the new until that new valuation basis has actually been adopted. But it is actually still a good news story in terms of where we are as a fund in terms of our funding level. Moving on to investment. Obviously, investment itself has been, an interesting period, shall we say, with regard to investment. It was another negative quarter. We were strategically just below the benchmark by 0.5% below that benchmark. And 3 years, we are actually operating at 4.7% over a 3-year period. Again, slightly below that benchmark. And the AUM of the fund to the end of June has actually dropped to just below that 3 billion mark on that side of things. Looking at just kind of a bit of a snapshot to the end of September, I think we're looking around performance levels across the board of for the fund on or around zero. So actually, with everything that's going on within markets and the world and the economies at this moment in time, actually that might not too much of an issue. But obviously, what we will have at the next meeting is obviously more updated figures with regard to that. In terms of the strategic asset allocation of the fund, that has actually come back a little bit more within its target range with the reduction in the equities during that quarter and the movement in the equities. We're now back within that target range of our strategic allocation from equities on that side. We're still holding a lot of money in the DRF, in the Diversified Returns Fund. That is still awaiting drawdown, and that money is earmarked to go into the private market. So where those allocations have been committed, we're still waiting for those investments now to be drawn down and moved forward and through. In terms of responsible investment, we have finally received one of the consultations. As you may recall, we were expecting some major consultation that incorporated everything from central government, from DLUC to come through, pooling guidance, TCFD, good governance, all of those aspects. Obviously, with the turmoil that we've actually seen recently within central government and other areas on that side and the changes that come through, that hasn't come through. So, but what has come through, and we are thankful, is that we have actually received the first consultation on the TCFD, on the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosure Regulations. This is something that we've been calling for as a body. It's something that's been in the private sector already, and it's something that we believe that should have been in the public sector. It is as expected on that side. The major differences are that there won't be a staging due to size. It will apply to the LGPS, from the outset, and the consultation looks at prescribing the metrics of which the funds should actually be reporting on. The reason and the rationale for that is so they then can collate that information and provide an LGPS-wide report. Obviously, if we're all doing it on different metrics and different bases, that is then very difficult. So having that prescription about what we would be reporting on will come through. Hopefully all members have got the date in your diary now of the 15th of November, and the workshop day that we are planning, which will be around that. And there will be a discussion with committee and with obviously board members' input as well around the response to that consultation. The response to that consultation is due by the 24th of November. So it will be something that we will gather the views from committee and board during that, draft the response, and then obviously have that delegation to the chair of committee to then respond accordingly on that side. But hopefully that workshop will actually bring that through. One of the key things that was debated quite heavily at committee was fund administration and the position with fund administration on that side. I think hopefully you might have picked that up from the minutes, and it is one area where we actually are going to do some work. So I'll just take a few moments just to walk through that. We are obviously this year, at the beginning of this year, we are in the triennial valuation. So every 3 years, the data that we supply to the actuary has to be of the highest possible quality, because it drives then the assessment of the assets and the liabilities of the fund, and then the contribution rates that apply to the employers. So during that period of time, we have spent and redeployed some of our internal resources to make sure that we are refining the data that we have, challenging the employers with the data, collating that accurately so we can then supply that to the actuary. One of the keys for me, and I'm sure Victoria, when she joins us later on, will comment on it, is the feedback that we've had from the actuary is that the data quality that we have submitted is a very, very high standard. So the assessment that the actuary then puts on the quality of the data, and then the onward the onward valuation that they get is of high quality on that side. And I'm sure I'm not putting words in Victoria's mouth. That was the words that was used at committee. So we put a lot of focus on that particular area. We still have those statutory deadlines of benefit statements, which is a byproduct of that information as well. But also what we have actually seen this quarter or this year so far, and it's still not finished yet, is an elongated audit process. As maybe some of you are aware that maybe deal with audits in your own environment, the audit industry are under a lot of pressure. The timetable we had, normally our audit is done by May or June. We are still going through the audit process at the moment. So unfortunately what happened is that the requirements for audit were hitting at the same time as we were trying to do the trial and valuation work, the same time we were trying to produce benefit statements. So there was a real pressure that was brought onto the team. So there was a reprioritization during that period to make sure we met those statutory obligations in terms of those aspects. As you know, one of the things that was agreed previously was about additional resources within the team. And that was very, very welcome back from committee to actually agree a large increase in our additional resources into the team. We've been going through that process of recruitment. And as I said previously, one of the positives for me is that we've actually managed to go through a recruitment process where existing members of the team have been successful in gaining promotions into higher positions. So we've had Chris and Zoe now as deputy or pension group leads or deputy managers that have moved up from lead pensions officers. Obviously that created a vacuum of lead pensions officers. We had a new lead pensions officer as part of that recruitment, so we had to go out and appoint 3 new lead pensions officers. Those 3, I'm very pleased to say, actually came from our pensions officer pool. But what that actually meant is every time we went through recruitment, what we were doing was not actually adding any additional resource into the team. It was actually moving the current resources around within that team. We are now, at this moment in time, filling those entry-level posts, those pensions officer posts. So we are now seeing a slight increase in terms of the resourcing within the team. We have 6 posts at pensions officer level. At the moment, we are a 22 head count. So you can see it's quite a significant amount of resourcing coming back into that team. The first advertisement we went out with, we were successful in appointing 2 candidates out of the 6 that we required. We went back out again to advert and another 3-week period for that. We've been successful in appointing another 2 candidates from that. So we're now having to go out for a 3rd time to try and actually get that, to actually get the amount of resources in. What we've also looked to do is when those resources come in, it doesn't have an immediate impact on the team because of the technical nature of the work, the processes and everything else. So there is a big training requirement, which obviously then draws away from the existing staff because they're the ones that predominantly provide that training. What we have looked to do is mitigate that as much as possible. So we've actually utilising Hymans to develop an onboarding and training programme for those new members of the staff. So it reduces the burden on the existing staff as we move through. So we are making progress on there. Now, what committee actually focused on was the KPIs and where we are sat within our KPIs at the moment. And there was concern around it. I think there was a comment made, and it may be captured in the minutes, that the employee representative on the committee actually said in the 6 or 7 years that he's been on committee, we've never actually achieved that KPI number, that 90% figure during that 6 or 7 years. I actually alluded to the fact that where we are is actually as a result of potentially resourcing that should have been brought on over the last 5 to 10 years as complexities have actually increased within the industry and as we have moved forward. So there's a lot of things that we need to look at and actually establish. What committee have actually asked is that I bring back a report and do some work. And I'm looking to try and work with Aon, an external body on this, to actually look at a number of items. One is, are we actually measuring our KPIs effectively? Are we actually measuring the correct KPIs? What should we be measuring and how can we actually then achieve it? But also to then benchmark our current resourcing and our future plan and actually provide a KPI that is actually something that is meaningful for us to actually be measured against at this moment in time within the resourcing levels we have. But then also an action plan of how we're then going to actually improve that with the resourcing, with the processes, with the IT systems. So there was a real focus from committee on that, and they have actually asked for additional work. And I think that's one of the key things that we need to actually make progress on, and obviously will be a key thing for board members because that's the interaction, with there. What I will say from those KPI numbers, I sat down yesterday with the administration manager and we actually looked at those numbers. There is an improvement from quarter to quarter on there in terms of the activity. But one of the other things that I would actually point out is that we are seeing yet again even more increases in terms of the volume of activity. And as an example, so far to the quarter ending September, so those 6 months, we've now processed 550 retirements. Last year, we had 968 in total for the entire year. So if we progress at the rate we're going, we will see another 150 retirements over and above what we actually processed last year with the same level of resourcing as we are there at that point. What the team are definitely focused upon is actually delivering an equal service to its members. So what we don't do is look at where, is that case beyond its KPI? We'll actually do casework below it. So the importance of actually looking at the average time taken per case or all cases that exceed target is the one focus area which I'm still very keen that the team actually work on. So we're providing that level service. What we're not doing is actually breaching any of our statutory obligations and our statutory timeframes for the payment of those benefits. But it's not obviously meeting the expectations of the service that the fund and the committee and the board want to actually provide at this time. So that in a snapshot was one of the key things that we debated and was debated at committee, and I'm sure you'd have picked that up from the minutes. And then moving forward, the other areas we looked at.
Fundamentally, is worth pausing and
yeah, I can do. Yeah,
there's an awful lot in this report. I was wondering if people wanted to raise any questions on what you covered already.
Yeah.
Before we move on, particularly that last aspect, which, as you said, a major discussion point for committee. So if people have got questions on either investment performance, responsible investment, or the we'll take those now, and then we'll move on to the rest of Matthew's report.
Thank you, Sean.
The only point I would make, Chairman, if I may, it goes back to the very beginning in the executive summary table. I entirely accept the point Matthew has made with regard to the triennial evaluation. That's perfectly natural. But I would have thought it might possibly be helpful to members if the table could be expanded by just simply one column showing the figures for the preceding 3 months. You know, the narrative talks about movements within the 3 months. I would have thought it would be helpful to members if, in fact, there was just an extra column showing in that table what the preceding figure was for the 3 months.
Matthew?
We will take. I'll take that up with that table is provided by the actuary to us, and I will feed that back to the actuary and see if we can get that added. If not, I will put that column on myself.
Okay. That's absolutely fine. I just thought it would be helpful for members on the board to have that information in view of the fact that the information was supplied in narrative form further on.
It's not a problem.
Oh, any other questions on investment performance, responsible investment, or the administration?
Can I just ask a question, Sean?
Yes, of course.
Appreciate the increase in retirements set to that, Matt, for this year. I was just wondering, 2021 to 22, obviously there seems to be a deep, maybe I missed it when you were talking, but on all the KPI, there seems, on the performance in table 1, there seems to be a reduction in all of them. I'm just wondering, was that due to staffing or something? So obviously that's the last full year. So estimates for employees 90 to 75%, retirement lump sums 8%, 64%, refunds 93 to 63. I was just wondering, was there a key factor to cause that during 20? From obviously that's the last full year we can look at, and I was just wondering, was there a factor there in that? Was it the staffing issues, or is there something fundamental there?
There's a number of drivers, John, and thank you for picking up on that. And yeah, I think one is some of it is complexity of case, and two is actually process, and within COVID, and actually maybe some of the internal processes. So, for an instance, where we've had the team working, as you know, through COVID, 1 week in, 1 week out. As an example, if somebody's taken a case and they're working from home and they process the case on the Monday, but they're not back in the office until the following Monday, then to actually then print the paperwork and then move that through the next process, there is a 4 or 5 day period where there's that nil activity. And that was ultimately something that was born out of the working practices due to COVID. So there was a slowing down in the process of what was actually measurable during that period of time, purely because of where people were located. So one of the key things that we need to actually look at, and I need to look at with my incoming administration manager and with the team, is how can we adapt our processes moving forward for a more flexible hybrid working. We got thrown into COVID, as we know, and if you know pensions administration, and I'm sure Sean will comment on it as well, it is very much a paper-based movement of a case from one person to the other that doesn't always function fully and easily through the basis. So the teams always used to sit together and pass those caseworks around. As soon as obviously COVID went and we actually had it, it impacted on the levels of the process. So that's one of my key things, is actually asking the question about these KPIs. What are these KPIs actually measuring? And I'll be honest with this. So what these KPIs are measuring is, at the point we can make the payment, we then make the payment within 15 working days. What that doesn't allude to is that that case might have been ongoing for 3 months prior to that point. So if you're looking at, say, death grants as an example, what is being measured under the current administration strategy is, at the point that the determination is made to actually pay the death grant to an individual, it's then got 8 days for you to process all the paperwork to actually physically make that payment. That's what's being measured. Now, that death case, in that scenario, you could have been toing and froing back and forth with parties for, we've had some of them that could have been for a year up until that point. But we're not measuring that at this moment in time. So there is a question mark for myself about whether or not the validity of what we're actually measuring. And that's why, rather than look at it with a sticking plaster about where we are with this KPI, I'm going to actually look to actually say, what are we actually measuring? How are we measuring it? And what is the impact of what we're actually doing? Because I'm not fully versed that we're actually measuring the right things at this moment in time. To measure those, we might end up having to look at systems, processes, and as part of that, actually then embedding those processes into hybrid working. So a little bit back to your original point, a little bit of what you're talking about there, the drop, is actually in reality about where somebody was situated at the point that they were actually doing that process, and then physically then coming back into the office and then being able to then pass it on to the next person to do their process, which was still that kind of maybe paper-based environment that we're operating in at the moment, John. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Sean, you've dropped off my screen. I can't see you.
Are there any other questions for Matthew on admin performance or investment performance?
I think the ones that I've just observed are I think there is a world where process improvements need to be looked at, and for efficiencies of ways of working, if that hasn't been adapted already, which clearly is showing in the results. And also in turn, that would fall into the triennial valuation with the data integrity. I would see that as a business as usual activity. When you're receiving the data in, the level of data integrity should be done at that point, rather than every 3 years, a big mammoth task and you're having to second people across. So I think there is a big thing for process improvements, which would then drive and improve those KPIs.
Yeah, just on that point, and there's a very key thing. Yes, data integrity is key to us. The majority of data we receive is via a year-end process from the employer. So we're receiving kind of 200 files from employers. We do ongoing every year look at that data integrity, but when we have the valuation, we are then on a tighter timetable to then be able to produce those valuation results. Whereas what we can do is actually plan the data integrity over a longer period of time into valuation, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. It impacts a little bit on benefit statements that need to have been applied by the end of August, which is what was normal. But with the valuation, we end up on a compressed timetable to allow us to actually get through the process of employer results and everything else within those time frames. So you're entirely right. Data integrity is something that is paramount to us ongoing. It's just that when we hit the valuation, it's compressed. Right. And one of the things that we did find this year as well, and it may be, again, this is a result, and maybe I'm not sure if Sean's experiences were the same. The quality of the data we received from a large amount of the employers was potentially some of the worst that we've had. And I think, again, that is maybe systematic of the processes or the impact that COVID had on the employer operations during that period of time as well. So I think there was a knock-on effect in terms of the quality we had. So there was more where we actually had to work back with the employers to actually interrogate the data and ensure that it was as robust as possible and as correct as possible. So we did feel that the quality of that initial receipt wasn't as high as it's been before. And I think, again, that was systematic of processes and others that other employers had gone through during that time. So it was just an observation from our side. And I don't know if Sean had a similar observation with his experiences. Maybe not. Maybe.
I think actually the situation in Oxfordshire is quite different. We implemented a couple of years ago the iConnect module, which means that we get our data from employers electronically on a monthly basis. So I think actually in Oxfordshire, you'd have got a different answer in that. We do a lot of validation of data on a monthly basis. There is some data that comes in at the end of the year, which only comes at the end of the year. But I think the pressures on us were less because we were doing more validation on a monthly basis. And I think that validation also meant that the employers were getting more used to exactly what they should be providing, because we were challenging them more regularly.
Yeah, and this is what we're doing with teachers' pension. We're doing that on a monthly basis. So I think for employers, it would just become the norm on sending that data monthly. So if that is something that could be looked at longer term, obviously it's not going to happen overnight, but I think that there are certainly some benefits for all parties in that. Yeah. I just wanted to add, I do share your sympathy with the additional workload that audit is bringing to the table. I am currently living that pain, so I do have sympathy for you and your team.
Yeah, thank you very much. And just on that point, that is one of the key things for me moving forward as well, is that how do we improve that interaction between employers and employees? And I think that's a compass upon the point. I think, yeah, iConnect or versions of iConnect with software providers is something that we will be looking to bring on. But I kind of acknowledge and thank you for your point, and that when you say, yeah, we know it's not going to happen overnight. This is very much a long-term, improvement plan that we need to put in place in this. And like I said, it's actually kind of looking back over what may or may not, and as Sean has said, they brought that in a few years ago in Oxford, that maybe that's where we are, that kind of 5 to 10 years of movement. We're playing that a little bit of catch up on that now. But I'm still focused on that delivery and getting to where we need to be with that. In the short to medium term. Thank you.
Apologies, Matthew, if I missed it, but in terms of your targets, the comment that was made at your committee about you hadn't hit the targets for 7 years, I think you said. Did the committee discuss actually reducing targets then to a more realistic level, or were they happy to continue with the targets at their current level?
Yeah, absolutely, Sean, and thank you for picking that up. Yeah, I did mention what the committee actually wants is for us to go back with setting targets that we can actually be held accountable to, rather than setting a number that has not been hit for 6 or 7 years and is unlikely to be hit with the current position we are. So what they wanted was an action plan that said, well, what are we going to measure? What is achievable at this point in time? But then also to have a plan of how we will increase those KPIs alongside an action plan to actually deliver that increase. So, and that's part and parcel of the work. So, when I took a step back, and that's why I've said that actually that's kind of maybe I would denote a bit of a sticking plaster over the top, just going back with a revised KPI over what we're currently measuring, and then actually dealing with it in that way. I don't think it might actually address the root cause of the overall performance ongoing, and I think it's wider than that. And that's why I'm kind of maybe introducing some work that hopefully some independence comes from it, with experience of where other funds are at as well, and learning from those to actually say, what are we measuring? How are we measuring? And are they appropriate, rather than just put a sticking plaster over our current measures, if those measures are actually not what we should actually be measuring, and is something that's tangible and actually a true reflection of the performance of the team, if that made sense. So to your point, Sean, yes, there will be a change to those KPIs that will be looked at, but I'm also looking at taking it a bit wider than that, because I think it needs to, and I think we need to actually look at the root cause, rather than just looking specifically at what we're currently doing.
Well, I'll take the views of the board, but personally, might be something that the board would be really interested to see, the outcomes of that report. And actually, personally, I'd be interested to see it, because, as you said, looking at what we measure in Oxfordshire and what you measure in Gloucestershire, we are running the same scheme. So we ought to be measuring something similar, if not exactly the same. So it may be useful, I think, to do some work together on that. But would board members like to spend a bit more time on looking at the KPIs and actually understanding what they are measuring, the relationship to the statutory responsibilities, etc., along the lines that Matthew's talked about?
I think what you've said, Sean, actually makes sense. I'm saying what would be really silly is to try and reinvent the wheel when in fact we're all operating the same local government pension schemes across the land.
That's quite right, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things that we will be looking at. What's the experience of others and what are they doing? I think a lot of it sometimes is also then system driven. What I'm also conscious about, and I'm sure others are as well, is that we don't end up in a cottage industry of producing and slowing that process. So it's about actually working the measure within the current process without it actually detracting from the process and actually becoming cumbersome and burdened. So I think that's where systems, to me, is actually one of the key things that we actually need to look at, and how can we develop the systems to do that reporting for us. I think, as Sean alluded to there, where they've looked at iConnect, I suspect that maybe their systems are actually doing a lot of that tracking for them, whereas maybe we're not at that level at this point in time. So that's what I actually want to actually try and establish, is how can we actually make everything we're doing meaningful, but make it actually, as seamless and as part of that process. And it's just an outcome of that process, and it's something that is easily measurable and tracked.
Sorry, can I just add to that? So I think there is a real that everyone is operating, I say everyone, but we're operating the same scheme. So you would expect to see similar KPIs, administration KPIs across the board. So there should be a degree of benchmarking that could be done. I'm not saying Oxfordshire I would expect Oxfordshire to be better if they have the systems in place to do that, but that would then highlight the work that needs to be done in terms of the efficiencies and administration, and whether that is implementing new systems, etc.
Yeah.
But I think I would expect there to be some commonality across the KPIs and not one specific to each fund.
Yeah, and that's what we will be looking at as well, is actually, you know, getting the experience of what others have done. So we've reached out across the Southwest Partnership. I actually said, well, what are you tracking? Because I think that might be quite an interesting debate. Obviously, every committee and board are responsible for providing their own administration strategy and agreeing that with employers. So it may well be that a differing committee might have a differing view on the importance of a particular process versus another. And then maybe set a target. I suspect we should be measuring the same things, but then I suspect that what it is a trade-off. What level of service our committee looking to actually provide, like with everything in life, and you get that with banking or others. Is it gold, silver, or bronze? Because there is a cost implication for that level of service that you want to deliver. If you want gold standard service with immediate response times, you're more likely over-resourcing yourself to allow for those periods when you're at your peak and others times. But where are you prepared to set your level and your benchmark, I think is the key. And I think that's the discussion that we'll be having both with yourselves at the board and committee as part of and it comes up onto the next bit, the governance review of the administration strategy. And I think from my perspective on this as well is that obviously, as you're aware, the current pensions administration manager is taking flexible retirement at the end of this month. We're in recruitment at the moment, in a recruitment cycle to hopefully find a replacement for that administration manager. What I would like, and one of the reasons why that's just maybe gone back a quarter or two on the action plan, is that I want that administration manager to have ownership with yourselves as the board and committee over that administration strategy moving forward. So as part of my kind of a team that we're actually, and I want that individual to have that ownership of what that strategy looks like in the future. And actually then we'll be able to support them to deliver that strategy as well. So, yeah, obviously there's changes within the senior management, which will then drive that through. But it's actually, I think, an exciting opportunity for an administration manager coming in, because they will be able to pick up and actually go, this is my vision and this is our vision. And I'm sure that hopefully that will align with my vision as well, and you know, of where we actually want that service to go.
Okay, are there any other comments or questions on this aspect of the report? No, I think you've got a way forward there, Matthew. Do you want to carry on then? I think you're up to business plan.
Yeah. And just very quickly then, just on the last few bits, obviously on the business plan that we published up on there, operating predominantly to target. Audit, I'll use that word again. That's the only bit that's not really operated to target. We're a little bit behind on our timetable that we set, rather than when the actual audit was set, when we put the business plan in place on there. We're still on target to publish the annual report on or before the 1st of December. If we haven't got the audit opinion, we will be doing the same as we did last time. We'll publish the annual report with the draft accounts in it. There will be a letter accompanying the annual report. And once they actually then get signed off, we will then actually move forward. As soon as I get the audit findings report, I will be circulating that both through to committee and board members, so you can see if there are any particular items that are on there. We're hopeful at the moment with the work that we've done that there isn't anything material within that audit findings report moving forward. And as I said, the governance review, obviously we reset some of the targets around the administration strategy and the communication strategy last time. The governance review, we're working to target on that. And the outcomes of the governance review. And there's a later agenda item over the governance policy and compliance statement, which was part and parcel of that. Just picking up on the national knowledge assessment, the LGPS national knowledge and skills assessment. We've launched that out now. We're partaking in that national knowledge assessment that is being done by Hymans. It is paramount for us because it allows us to be able to set our training strategy. So it's part of the training policy that every year we'll undertake this with committee and board members. It's really vital because it will actually inform the training plan moving forward. and highlight those particular areas. So hopefully you've seen some emails. I think I did ping out a chaser email. The deadline has been extended, I think, to the 3rd of November. And in my role as chair of the Oxford Local Pensions Board, I've actually completed the knowledge and skills assessment. And what they do is give you an individual report to tell you what your score is, and also benchmark the questions that you got right or wrong. I'm not going to suggest what my score was at this meeting. But all I'll say is make sure you read the question. Some of those questions are really badly worded. That's what I'll say.
I really what? Matthew, what did you say? Really what?
So no, there's some of the questions. Obviously, just kind of read the questions. Is just make sure that you read them. It's kind of the way that they're written is very nuanced in certain quarters.
Right.
But,
and watch out for the ones
that I might have got
all of the above as well.
Sorry, Michael.
Watch out for the ones where there's an all of the above in there as well, because there's a couple of them. I'd not seen anything about the extension, so I got the notification I had was the closing date was yesterday, so I rushed through it in between meetings. So I went, right, that's done.
Well, thank you very much for doing that, Michael. Yeah, no, it has. I think it's been extended to the 3rd of November. But obviously, the response rates will be brought back to yourselves in terms of that, and the committee as well, and will be benchmarked, nationally on that. But it will inform that strategy, so that's key. And then the last thing for me on this one. The LGPS performance benchmarking report. Now, this was a separate standalone item for committee. I brought it in and added this to your papers because, again, it's a bit of a backward look on there. Obviously, as you're aware, we partake in the performance benchmarking. There's 63 LGPS funds that do out of the 89. Covers about 250 billion. 5 funds within Brunel actually partake in it over that period of time. What's interesting, I think, with all of these things with league tables, when you look at it, it gives you a snapshot, and it gives you an idea of what's going on. But it's also, you can look at it in one or two ways. So over that 1 year, our performance was disappointing. We have a higher weighting to equities and less in alternatives than the majority. 12 months ago, I was reporting how wonderful we had done over a 1 year basis because of our high position in equities and our lower position in alternatives compared to the peer group. So 12 months is always a bit of a cycle in terms of where you look at it. So 12 months ago, I was actually saying how wonderful we'd done against our peer group and our benchmark because that 12 months was higher. Obviously, this time it is lower, but it kind of is driven by that strategic asset allocation. I think what is useful, it actually shows the trajectory or the strategic allocations of a number of other funds. Where are they positioning their weighting in terms of equities and their risk versus their alternative allocations? And as we know, within Gloucestershire, the alternative investments has something that's come on stream fairly recently, from about 2016 onwards, whereas a lot of other funds have got more mature and well-developed alternative asset class investments, infrastructure, private equity, private debt, compared to where Gloucestershire have moved over that short period of time. On the longer cycles, on the 5 and 10 years, we're on the medium, but I'd still kind of iterate that the important thing is for us is about what is that we're setting our target expectation to. What is the requirement of our fund in terms of investment performance versus the actuarial assumptions that are put down? And are we meeting those objectives more than where are we on a league table? Because those league tables can also decry about where is the funding position of some of those funds. Are they taking more risk? Are they taking less risk? So I think that it's one part of the story. I think sometimes we can read that, if you remember the Section 13 report that we alluded to, where the government actually look at everybody's valuation and they benchmark them on separate, where we end up on terms of that. And I think it gets read in conjunction with those. But we do partake in that benchmarking exercise. We will report that back because I think it's good information for us as a committee and a board to have over that longer term about the trajectory of what other funds are doing in that particular area. But personally, I would just kind of caution it because it's more about what's important for Gloucestershire rather than that on that particular league table. And at that point, Sean, I'll stop there.
Okay, are there any questions on the second part of Matthew's report? Can't see any hands up, Matthew. I think we're simply asked to note the position. I think we've already given you some feedback on the administration piece and the earlier comment from Colin on the investment evaluation piece. So people are happy to note the rest?
Yes.
Yeah, noted.
Thank you.
Yeah. Fine by me.
Then takes us on to item 6, which is the risk register.
Yeah.
You go, Matthew.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. Yeah, very quickly on this one. I think obviously the risk register in your papers, hopefully now, has all of the risks, and including that new risk 8 has actually come through. That was unfortunately that was me on my print range last time I did it, so I do apologise for that. I know that there was the change to the labelling that has been fed back to the developer to ensure that the the heat map, the covering heat map actually has that the right labelling and consistency on there. Predominantly, there aren't any changes to the risk register from quarter to quarter at this particular time, and the last assessment that was made in June on there. We're still having some elevated risks around recruitment and around that process, as you would establish, because of what the conversation we previously had on the fund administration. But predominantly, there aren't any changes or movements in terms of the risks, and we still remain with some elevated risks at this particular time. So I'll stop there, Sean, and answer any questions on that.
Okay, are there questions for Matthew on the risk register? No? I think people on the risk register, again, I think we just asked to note the risk register and the current elevated risks as outlined in the report. People happy to do that?
I agree.
Okay, thank you. In which case, Matthew, to move on to item 7 then, which is the governance policy and compliance statement.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. So again, I kind of take a lot of this paper as read. Just this was part of the governance work plan, was to review the governance policy and compliance statement and make sure it is up to date. This kind of encompasses the work that we've done as part of the governance and work plan. So as part of that, it's coming towards the end of that process and ensuring that we're encapsulating the changes that have been made within the governance structure and within the governance policy. So the policy itself as now actually includes those approved policies that have come before it: the training policy, the conflicts of interest policy, the breaches, and the risk management policy. So this is kind of overarching. The governance policy statement will form part of the annual report. So it just reflects the current governance structure and operations of the committee and the board. So it includes obviously the updated terms of reference of the pensions committee, where we increase the number of employer representatives on the pensions committee. It reflects those new terms of reference. It reflects the terms of reference of the of the board as well. Also within there is obviously the compliance statement, where the fund has to go through a policy of actual review of its, within a framework about its compliance within those certain areas of governance, and whether they fully comply, partially comply, or it is not applicable. And I think we've gone through that review, and Aon have partaken in that review with us as well, of where we sit against the principles and the standards that are set down. And what is pleasing is that we are fully compliant in the areas that we need to be. There are some not applicables because we don't have subcommittees on committee on that we are passing ourselves as being fully compliant within the principles and the governance structures that we have within there on the majority, on all of the areas in terms of structure, representation, selection and role members, and voting, and so on and so forth, and in terms of training and other parts from that. So I think from that perspective, the assessment of where we are and that compliance statement actually shows a good picture of where we are. And then the final part, which was the Appendix B, which was the delegation of functions. And what this was actually ensuring that it was fully captured the operational activities that take place on a day-on-day basis and the responsibility, and importantly, how that communication and monitoring is actually undertaken. There is a high-level scheme of delegation within the council's constitution. What this is actually the day-to-day, which delegates the administering authority to the Pensions Committee. What this is an onward delegation around the effective operational side. So the rebalancing of the portfolio to the strategic asset allocations. Who does that? How is it done? And then how is it reported back? So there is that level of accountability and that transparency of operations. So it's fully known where all of those sits. Both the policy and the compliance statement and the scheme of delegation were approved at committee, and it's coming back to yourselves to obviously review what has been approved by committee to ensure that it actually meets the requirements and that you as a board are satisfied that the committee have undertaken their duties effectively within these particular areas. And I'll stop at that, Sean. Thank you.
So I think, Matthew, I think the key issue then for the board is, are the board happy that in terms of that compliance statement, the fund is fully compliant with its responsibilities? Was there any area that you want to question or challenge Matthew on? Or are people content that, having reviewed it, that Gloucestershire Fund is fully compliant with its responsibilities under the governance policy and compliance statement? Any comments or questions or challenges for Matthew?
I think it's good to see that we're fully compliant across the board.
Okay. So I think in terms of the recommendation we were asked to review, so I think we have reviewed, and therefore to acknowledge the statement and the policy. People are happy to acknowledge them and agree they're accurate reflection.
Yep, happy to do that.
Yes, happy to do that.
Yep.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think that then takes us on, Matthew, to item 8, which is your financial statements. I take it you're not going to go through those page by page.
No, absolutely not. Yeah. So I think as part of that good governance process, you may recall in your previous pack and was taken committee was the audit plan. So that kind of showed what audit we're going to look at. What you've got in front of you here is the draft financial statements that we were submitted to the auditors to be audited during that. So obviously the covering report just picks out kind of 2 tables, basically the fund accounts to the end of the year, 31st of March, and the net asset values statement as at the end of March. On that side, that is going through that audit process at the moment. As I said, normally by now we would be bringing you the audit findings report, the financial statements has been audited and agreed for to be noted on that side. Obviously, we're not at that point at this moment in time. Obviously, during that 12 months, we've talked about it before, the fund actually experienced strong growth, even with the impact of the Ukraine crisis right towards the end of the financial year. So we are showing an overall increase of the fund of just over 200 million during that financial year, leading us to about a £3.1 billion fund. As we know, since March, that has been a movement down on that particular position. We are looking through, that. Obviously, these statements will form part of the annual report. They will form part of the Gloucestershire County Council's accounts as well. It is the role of the Audit and Governance Committee to actually sign off the audit process and the accounts, which will include these. But obviously, what was happening here is that we took these to the Pensions Committee for them to recommend those draft accounts onto the Audit and Governance Committee, because they are the ones that are tasked with that. So you can see there is a due process that has been followed on that side. Obviously, once we get the audit findings report, I will circulate that around all parties. But predominantly, this is what the auditors are currently still working through at this time. And I'll stop there and see if anyone's got any questions on any particular parts of the financial statements. Sure.
Can I, Chairman, just simply ask one question purely for information? Who actually appoints the external auditor?
The external auditor is appointed by the council and not by the pension fund. It's by the council, because the pension funds aren't separate accounts. They still form part of the council's accounts. The council utilised the Crown framework, I think it is, or one of the the national framework of procurement of that. They are going through a process that I think next year's audit will be the same, of actually going back to that framework again, rather than going out independently and actually retendering that audit contract for the future. But at the moment, Colin, because it's the pension fund accounts sit within the council's accounts, that auditor is appointed by the council, the county council, and that then applies to the pension fund. Obviously, if there was a change and the pension fund accounts became standalone in the future, then I believe that obligation would then pass to the pensions committee to appoint that auditor. Would be my understanding, but I that may or may not be a correct assumption. But I would assume that if it was standalone in the future, it would. But at the moment, it's the council.
Thank you.
I was just going to say, Matthew, I think the PSAA have just done the announcement of the six successful audit companies. And so the county will be currently being consulted on who their appointed one is. We're being consulted on ours. So I'm sure the county council are in the same position at the moment.
Thank you, John. Yeah, my understanding is that pool has reduced a little bit, hasn't it? I think there was one or two of the bigger players that had decided to exit the market. I might be wrong, but I will do a bit of digging and have a look at that.
That's correct. Yeah, the 6 been appointed. People like Deloitte have dropped out, but there's other ones come in. So yeah.
Thank you, John.
Are there any other questions on the financial statements? I've got one, Matthew. I'm not sure it's on the financial statements. It's more a question of, because the financial statements are in front of me, I'm going to ask the question. And it's an issue for auditor as well. But yesterday's CPI figure of 10.1, if that's applied to all pension payments, what does that do to your cash flow? Because looking at your figures, you're currently about £10 million in credit in terms of dealing with members. A 10% increase in pensions will wipe most of that out. What are the implications for the pension fund if that is the case?
Yeah, that's a very, very good point, Sean. My answer will be, I don't know at the moment, but we are modelling some cash flow work on exactly those parameters on the basis of the outcome of the valuation and the new employer contribution rates. And we will be bringing that report back to committee in December. And then obviously onwardly, the board will see that report as well in terms of cash flow. So it is a very live issue for us to actually understand that. Obviously, what the financial statements do also reflect, especially on employer contribution rates, is that we do have, and we do give a number of employers the opportunity to prepay a lump sum against their contribution rates. And if they do that, that's why at the end, because this is kind of predominantly coming towards the final years of the previous valuation cycle, if some of those employers have done that, we do get a spiky cash flow. So we are modelling that cash flow, Sean, and that report will be coming back to committee in December, and to the next board meeting, you'll see that as well. But it's a very live issue if that 10.1% comes through.
That would be exactly the same answer as I give you tomorrow if you ask me the same question.
Thank you, Sean. I'll ask you the question.
Are there other questions?
Are you happy having a spiky result, or would we like somehow to level things out?
It's an interesting one, obviously. Yeah, and that's why we're modelling that, Stephen, in terms of that, because obviously what happens is that the fund gets the benefit of that injection of capital to invest during that period. So it does work. But what we do need to be conscious of is that, and this is again working closely with our employers to ensure that we don't get into a scenario where we do have a big wodge that gets invested, but then we've then got to transact and actually sell assets or
Yeah.
during that period of time. We're still very cash flow positive, but we also do have a lot of income generating assets as well. Dividend payments that we're receiving, we do reinvest those, but we could easily bring that back. But as we move more into the alternative, they are a bit more cash flow generative in their nature. So we can always look at how we deliver on that side. I don't believe that we will be in a position where we're a fund where we're having to sell assets to pay for our pension liabilities at this point in time. We're not even at the point where we need to actually have distributing units rather than reinvesting units of things like on equities at this point in time. But it is something to be alive on, and it is something that will become from that cash flow. But also we'll be looking at, in some ways it's a dialogue with the employers, because within their positioning at the moment, they might not want to actually take advantage of that front loading of what they did in the past as well. So we're in live dialogue with them at this moment in time, and I'm sure Victoria might allude to some of that when she gets onto the next agenda item.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Are there any other questions on financial statements? No. In that case, I think we just asked to note the financial statements. People happy to note them?
Yes.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think that then takes us into the exempt session. Andy, I think you need me to read the wording.
If you could please, Sean, and then if you could just pause there whilst I take out the Becky bot and stop the YouTube stream. Thank you.
So that in accordance with section 100A4 of the Local Government Act 1972, the public be excluded from the meeting for the following agenda items, because it is likely that if members of the public were present, there would be disclosure to them of exempt information as defined in paragraph 3 of part 1 of schedule 12A to the Act, and the public interest in withholding information outweighs the public interest in disclosing the information to the public.
Thank you. Are you all in agreement?
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, can you just give me a moment, please?